Close your eyes, let the centuries fall away. It is 186 BCE, and you are standing in the atrium of a Roman household, watching your daughter prepare for marriage. You have wealth, influence, the kind of name that opens doors and closes mouths. Everything has been arranged with precision, a favorable match, a generous dowry, a future that looks stable on parchment. She is 16 years old, raised in obedience, schooled in silence, trained to perform the role expected of her, a perfect Roman bride. The ceremony unfolds without flaw. Prayers echo through marble halls. Omens declare the gods are pleased. Wine flows, guests murmur approval, and your daughter, she smiles when the moment calls for it. A rehearsed expression, a mask worn so well even she might believe it. But then the celebration ends, the crowd thins. The torches dim and something else begins, something no one names aloud, something ancient. Something buried so deep in Roman custom that even the historians who chronicled empires avoided writing it down. Your daughter is led away, not by her husband, not yet, by others, older women, temple attendants. Their face is solemn, unreadable, and as she crosses the threshold, she looks back. One last time, her eyes find yours. There is a question in that gaze, unspoken but undeniable. You do not answer. You turn away, not out of cruelty, not because love has abandoned you, but because you know what waits for her in the dark. And you know you cannot stop it. This is not myth, not slander invented by Rome's enemies centuries later. What I am about to reveal comes from legal fragments that were never fully explained, from plays that were censored, from chambers carved beneath temples, from names etched into stone without context or mercy. Taken together, these remnants paint a portrait of something profoundly disturbing, a place where religion, law, and marriage converged, and where women disappeared into rituals no one dared question. Here is what scholars now accept. Between roughly 300 BCE and 200 CE, Roman marriage was not merely a private arrangement between families. It was a transaction overseen by forces far older and far less transparent. A bride did not simply pass from father to husband. She passed through something else first. Legal texts make this clear, though they do so in language deliberately vague, carefully sterile. A marriage could not be validated until certain sacred obligations were fulfilled. Obligations administered not by grooms but by priests. Later writers would gesture toward concepts like ius primae noctis, the right of the first night. That exact phrase does not appear in Roman law. But Roman sources circle around something eerily similar, a ritual framed as divine offering, sometimes referenced under the term deditio deorum, a giving over to the gods. The terminology matters, because this was never called violence. It was called duty. If you believe the silence deserved to be remembered, if you believe buried histories must be exhumed no matter how uncomfortable, then stay with me. Your engagement keeps this story alive. Now let us descend into what Roman fathers refused to explain. Under Roman law, a woman existed under manus, the hand. First her father's hand, then upon marriage her husband's. But legal and religious sources suggest something unsettling. This transfer was not automatic. It required purification. That word surfaces again and again in the fragments, purificatio, not metaphor, not symbolism. A ritual act performed by those who claim to speak for the divine. Among the most prominent were the priests of Bona Dea, the good goddess whose cult centered on fertility, protection, and household order. Her rites were secret, legally shielded from public scrutiny. Roman religion functioned on exchange. You offered something, the gods granted favor. Harvests, stability, children, but in marriage the offering was not grain or livestock. The offering was the bride herself. Imagine it, you are 16, perhaps 17. You have been told all your life that marriage is your highest calling. You understand obedience. You understand silence. You understand endurance. What you do not understand, because no one has ever told you, is that before you belong to your husband, you must first be offered to the gods. And the gods, it is said, require proof. Beneath Rome's temples, archaeologists have uncovered chambers that defy easy explanation. They are not crypts, they are not storage, they share a pattern, one that chills the blood. Stone platforms shaped like beds, grooves carved into floors designed to channel liquid away, doors reinforced designed to lock from the outside. In 2003, excavations beneath a temple on the Aventine Hill, long associated with Bona Dea, revealed one such space in remarkably intact condition. The architecture was disturbing enough, but what truly haunted investigators were the walls, hundreds of names, all female, many accompanied by dates. When cross-referenced with surviving marriage records, those dates aligned. British archaeologist Catherine Johns spent 3 years documenting the site. Her conclusion was measured, cautious in the way academics speak when they know the implications are explosive. She noted that these inscriptions appeared to record women who underwent a ritual tied to marriage eligibility. She added carefully that the precise nature of the ritual was not explicitly stated. That phrase, not explicitly stated, appears often in scholarship surrounding this topic. It is not ignorance, it is restraint. What follows is a reconstruction drawn from fragmentary plays, veiled commentary, and the physical evidence itself. After the public wedding ceremony concluded, the bride was not taken home. Her husband was excluded, told to wait. Instead, she was escorted by female attendants, women who had undergone the same rite, toward the temple. She descended, away from lamplight, away from witnesses. Stone steps spiraling downward, cold air rising to meet her. A chamber beneath the city. What happened next, the sources disagree. Some suggest one priest. Others imply more. The inconsistency itself speaks volumes. The playwright Plautus, writing in the early 2nd century BCE, alluded to such rites in a comedy later stripped of certain lines. In one surviving fragment, a character observes, "The gods take their portion before any man." Another asks what the bride receives in return. The answer, purification if she survives it. That line does not appear in later copies. The philosopher Lucretius, writing in the 1st century BCE, was more direct. His words survived only because a single manuscript escaped medieval erasure. He writes, "They call these rites sacred, but they are terror. What the priest claims to offer the gods, he takes for himself, and the law shelters the theft by naming it divine. Now return to the role of the father. You know this exists. You know your daughter will undergo it. And you do nothing, not because you are heartless, but because resistance would mean defying religion, defying law, defying the weight of centuries." Tradition in Rome was not suggestion. It was inevitability. The system was architected so that refusal destroyed you. And this was only the beginning, because the true power of the system was not force, it was silence. What made this practice so difficult to expose both in antiquity and now was not a shortage of victims, it was the law. Roman women who participated in sacred rites were not merely discouraged from speaking, they were legally prohibited. Certain ceremonies were classified as mysteria, protected by statutes governing religious secrecy. To reveal them was not testimony, it was blasphemy. The Lex Voconia, passed in 169 BCE, included provisions governing religious disclosure. Women who spoke of sacred rites could be charged with impiety, punished with exile, seizure of property, or death. This is why the historical record feels hollow, punctured with euphemism and evasion. The victims were silenced by law. The perpetrators called it holy. And the men who wrote history often benefited from the system, but silence is not forgetting. And sometimes, when words are forbidden, people leave evidence in other ways. In the 1920s, archaeologists excavating a villa near Pompeii uncovered a sealed chamber. It had not been closed by volcanic ash. The doorway had been deliberately bricked shut before the eruption. Inside, a fresco. At first glance, a conventional Roman wedding, bride at the center, groom beside her, guests gathered in celebration, familiar iconography, but in the background, partially obscured, was another scene. a woman being led downward by robed figures. Her body angled away from the feast, her head turned back, one arm reaching toward a man who was not following. The archaeologist who documented it made a striking observation. The hidden figure's face, barely visible, was painted with greater precision and emotional detail than the bride at the center of the image. Someone wanted that face to be seen. They could not describe the ritual openly. That would have been illegal, but they could paint it, they could hide it. And they could hope that someday someone would understand that is not passive acceptance, that is documentation. After the ritual concluded, the bride was returned to the celebration. Hours had passed, sometimes an entire day. Roman wedding customs included a detail that puzzled historians for generations. The bride appeared before her husband wearing a veil called the flammeum, thick and brightly colored. What made this unusual was not the veil itself, but the rules surrounding it. The veil was never removed, not during the feast, not during the procession, not even during consummation. For centuries, scholars interpreted this as modesty, an expression of Roman virtue. But a closer examination of ancient medical literature suggests something darker. Feminist historian Amy Richlin, analyzing gynecological texts, highlighted a passage written by the physician Soranus in the 2nd century CE. In a treatise on women's health, Soranus notes that newly married brides often exhibited signs of recent physical trauma. He advises physicians and husbands alike the veil serves a double purpose. It preserves modesty and it prevents the husband from observing signs of the purification rite which might provoke improper questions. Read that again. The veil did not symbolize virtue, it concealed evidence. The bride could not speak about what had happened, that was illegal. The husband was discouraged from noticing, that was custom, and any distress was dismissed as nervousness, fear, inexperience. The system did not require universal belief, it required compliance, and for generations it worked. In 186 BCE, the system nearly shattered. That year, a Roman woman named Hispalia Ficenia went before the consul and testified about abuses within the bacchanalia, secret religious rites operating across Italy. Her testimony, recorded by the historian Livy, described underground chambers, sexual violence carried out under religious authority, victims bound by silence laws. The Senate reacted with fury. Investigations were launched, priests were arrested, rites were banned, leaders were executed, thousands punished. Rome wanted to make an example of the bacchanalia. But something else happened during that investigation. Several women attempted to testify about marriage purification rituals, rites connected not to foreign cults, but to Roman tradition itself. The Senate refused to hear them. According to Livy, the consul Spurius Postumius dismissed the requests with a statement that revealed everything: the bacchanalia are foreign corruptions. The rites of bona dea are Roman tradition. We do not investigate tradition. Those words are the backbone of every system that survives abuse. Call it ancient. Call it sacred, call it tradition, and suddenly it becomes untouchable. The women who attempted to testify were warned to remain silent or face charges of impiety. Most complied. One did not. Her name does not survive. She stood in the forum and publicly described what had happened to her beneath the temple. Within hours, she was arrested, charged with impiety and public obscenity, exiled to Sicily, forbidden from returning to Rome, forbidden from speaking to Roman citizens. She disappears from the historical record. But not everything disappears. In 1964, archaeologists discovered graffiti carved near the Roman Forum. The lettering style and surrounding context date it to approximately 80 BCE, just a few years after the Bacchanalia scandal. It reads, "Tradition is what monsters call their crimes when no one stops them." Someone carved that message into stone at the heart of Roman political power. Someone risked everything to leave it behind, and that brings us to what Rome could never fully erase: The ritual did not vanish, it evolved. By the late 1st century BCE, elite families began finding ways around it. Instead of submitting their daughters to full purification rites, they paid for symbolic ceremonies. Rituals without chambers, without descent, without physical contact. The priests accepted these substitutions. Of course they did. Because this had never truly been about religion, it was about power. Once wealth could buy exemption, the nature of the system became impossible to ignore. Among elite families, the practice gradually faded. Among the poor, it did not. They could not afford alternatives. The satirist Juvenal, writing around 100 CE, noted this disparity with bitter clarity. The poor still offer their daughters to the old gods. The rich offer gold instead. The system did not end because it was recognized as wrong. It weakened because participation became optional for those with power. And that distinction, who can opt out and who cannot, reveals everything about what the system was designed to protect. For centuries, classical scholars minimized or dismissed accounts like these. They described the evidence as fragmentary. They warned against trusting ancient sources. They suggested exaggeration, misinterpretation, later invention. They did everything except confront the pattern itself. Why? Because acknowledging this practice forces an uncomfortable conclusion. That Rome, so often praised as the foundation of Western law and civilization, embedded coercion and sexual exploitation into rituals presented as sacred and lawful. It means admitting that Roman marriage was not merely a private contract. It was a transaction that, in certain contexts, placed women's bodies under religious authority before transferring them to husbands. That realization destabilizes the traditional story of Roman virtue, order, and progress. So scholars hesitated. They focused on what could be safely admired: architecture, engineering, jurisprudence. And they avoided asking what those systems cost the people with the least power. But in the last few decades, that avoidance has become harder to maintain. Archaeology does not argue. Underground chambers exist beneath temples long associated with marriage and fertility rites. Inscriptions exist, names carved by women who left no other testimony. Legal language exists, vague, euphemistic, but persistent. Literary references exist, censored, fragmented, but consistent in tone. Individually, each piece might be dismissed. Together, they form a pattern. In 2018, a research team affiliated with the American Academy in Rome published a comprehensive review of available evidence relating to premarital purification rituals in Roman religious practice. Their conclusion was measured, careful, and difficult to ignore. They wrote that the evidence strongly suggests certain purification rites associated with marriage involved coercive sexual acts carried out under religious authority, reinforced by legal and social structures that prevented resistance or accountability. That is academic language. Translated plainly, this happened. It was not accidental, and the system protected itself. And yet, this is not only a story about abuse. It is also a story about resistance, quiet, dangerous, easily erased, but real. There was the woman who stood in the forum and spoke, knowing exactly what would happen to her. She was not saved, but she refused to pretend. There was the artist who painted the hidden fresco in Pompeii, carefully rendering a face meant to be overlooked, trusting that someone in the future might see it. There was the person who carved a sentence into stone near the Roman Forum, naming tradition for what it was. There were families who found ways to avoid the ritual, not because they challenged the system openly, but because they chose their daughter's safety over unquestioned obedience. There were historians and copyists who preserved dangerous fragments, even when the safer option was silence. None of these people stopped the machine on their own, but they documented it, they left traces. And those traces survived Rome's power. This history reveals something Rome tried very hard to hide. Systems of abuse rarely collapse because everyone suddenly agrees they are wrong. They collapse because enough people refuse to participate. Because enough people withdraw consent, because enough people leave records, because enough people decide that tradition does not excuse cruelty. The wealthy families who paid for symbolic rituals did not suddenly develop moral clarity. They acted out of self-interest. But that was enough. One family refusing, then 10, then 100. Eventually, priests could no longer insist that participation was universal. The ritual lost its inevitability, and once inevitability disappears, so does authority. You can stand in Rome today and see the remains of these temples. On the surface, there is nothing dramatic. Broken columns, scattered stone, tourists pass by without stopping. But beneath the ruins, the chambers remain, and on the walls, the names are still there. Julia, Cornelia, Flavia, Fulvia, women whose fathers brought them here. Women who underwent rituals they were forbidden to describe. Women who could not testify, could not accuse, could not refuse, so they did the only thing they could. They carved their names not as rebellion, not as protest, but as proof of existence. I was here. This happened to me. They left those words without letters, trusting that someday someone might understand what they were not allowed to say. We found them. We understand. And we refuse to let Rome's version of history be the only one that survives. If this exposed something you were never taught, something that slipped through the cracks of every history lesson, then stay. Subscribe, turn on notifications. This work exists to uncover the practices powerful institutions tried to erase. Before you go, ask yourself this: how many other traditions across history function the same way? How many customs we call sacred were actually systems of control? How many names are still hidden in sealed rooms, waiting to be noticed? The Roman marriage purification ritual is not unique because it was especially cruel. It is unique because enough evidence survived for us to see it. The machinery behind it, authority disguised as holiness, violence reframed as duty, silence enforced by law, appears again and again across cultures and centuries. The question is not whether it happened elsewhere. The question is whether we are willing to investigate our own traditions with the same honesty. Rome could not answer that question. Can we? The names are still on the walls, waiting not for revenge but for acknowledgement. And now that we have found them, we cannot pretend they were never there. We hear you.